Work group members, good afternoon, members of the public, members of our public who are listening remotely. We are calling to order our work group meeting, our accountability work study work group meeting today. I do want to start just before we formally begin our discussion with just taking a moment of silence, if we can, just thinking about the unspeakable tragedy and the senseless act of violence and the most recent school shooting in the Uvalde, Texas community. 19 children have been killed, and I believe one adult, and there's one adult and one child that's currently still in serious and critical condition. So if we could just take a moment of silence and recognition of that pain's community, that community's tremendous pain and the ripple effects of that across our country. Thank you. Superintendent.
Just wanted to let you all know that I did reach out to our sister agency in Texas on behalf of the administration, the board, and the state as a whole to offer our sympathies, and we stand ready to assist in anything we might be able to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that update. Much appreciated. And with that, in order to engage in formal discussion, we will be making a motion today, and as you'll recall, board members, we will be having discussion on a set of recommendations that we will ultimately be bringing forward to a set of recommendations aligned with the report that we will be bringing forward to the June meeting. So may I please yes, Mr. Murray.
Yeah, since we're taking a vote, does that mean that we need to take public comment? That's
Yes.
what I thought. I want to double
It
check.
does. We will be taking public comment today.
Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Yeah, there are comment cards right there for anybody who'd like to share. Okay, so may I please have a reading of the motion?
I just need a motion to receive the report at this time.
Okay, can I please have a motion? Okay,
Mr. Garvey.
Mr. Garvey, and a second, Mr. Morris. Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Lambert, would you please walk us through the report?
Of course. So what we're hoping to do today is go through a set of recommendations related to the conversations that the study group has had over the last several meetings. What we're going to do is go through the purpose of the study group membership. We're going to talk through the recommendations, some summaries of the discussion, and we hope that at the end we will have a conversation and have a vote on each of the recommendations for Ms. Orange-Jones to put into the final report. So the first slide, actually slide 3, the purpose of the study group and membership. In August 2021, BESE formed a study group to explore how the state measures, values, and rewards growth in the accountability formula. Subsequently, the board expanded the role of the study group to study the entirety of Louisiana's K-12 accountability system and provide BESE with considerations for adopting changes to the state's accountability formula, and the membership is listed below. Throughout the conversation, we have consistently had these words in the slide presentations around the purpose of our accountability system. These will be included in the report pending any feedback today. To improve student academic achievement, it must motivate adults in the building to focus on student academic growth and measurable outcomes and provide a fair assessment of performance for purposes of communication and prioritizing resources, energy, and intervention on schools in need of improvement. Any discussion at this point?
Mr. Morris.
Yeah, I know this is not a new slide, it's been out there for a couple of meetings, but I did get some feedback on the slide, and frankly, I support the feedback I got. The first bullet, with regard to it should motivate adults in the building to focus on student academic growth and measurable outcomes. You know, in my mind, a little more detail to that thought. I thought maybe something would be a little more appropriate would be that they should recognize opportunities for all students, and it should provide incentive for pursuit of those opportunities.
Can I say that one more time into the record?
In lieu of motivate adults in the building, but we should consider that the purpose, one of the purposes of the accountability system is to appropriately recognize opportunities for all students and appropriately incentivize pursuit of those opportunities.
Okay. And would you like to say a sentence or two more about why we think those changes enable us to have a more precise definition around the purpose of our system?
Sure. Because what we're doing is we're looking at a system that does recognize the opportunities that are out there. Whether or not you're on a Jumpstart track or you're on a Tufts University track, there are certain opportunities along both of those pathways, and the system, the accountability system, should recognize all of those opportunities. And then the accountability system should recognize accomplishments along either of those pathways and appropriately incentivize students to pursue either of those pathways relative to their interests, as opposed to motivate the adults in the building. That just didn't sit well with me personally.
Okay. Any other discussion from other members of the study group on Mr. Morris's potential revision?
You still like the last part, though, focus on student growth, Mr. Morris, or you want to take that whole?
Sure, I think you can blend it in.
Okay, good.
I'd like to keep that.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think, just saying.
Thanks.
I
Okay,
agree.
let's keep going into challenges and findings.
So real quick process overview is on slide 6. Following winter, the study group was focused on gaining a deeper understanding of our system. In the spring, we focused on how we're currently and how we could measure student growth. We focused on high school measurement and reasons for different scores between elementary and high schools. Today and in the month of June, the study group and board will provide direction and recommendations of next steps for the administration. During the summer, we'll have ongoing stakeholder feedback on measures, resource needs, goal attainment, and other ideas that will be covered later on in these slides. And as needed, the study group will reconvene based off of the feedback that we're receiving. And then in August, BESE would consider any actions. Continual through that process, and this process has been a review of simulations and impact on school performance scores and various things related to the simulation. Any concerns about this process?
Mr. Morris?
Yeah, I have a comment on that one too I'd like to offer. Early on in the process, I had asked the group to consider developing an Excel spreadsheet that tracked every topic that we discussed, whether or not we had closed out that topic or not. If we had closed it out, what the supporting documentation is for closeout, and then if the topic was not closed out, then what's the status on closing it out, and who's got the ball. So I know that that's a matter of record. And then also, I had met with a number of constituents in my district and gotten significant feedback from them, and then put that in an Excel format and forwarded that to the group as well. So point being, based on one of the things I based my comments on is the feedback that we got at the SAC meeting this week, with sensitivities with regard to the amount of input provided to the group. Just want to capture that there has been input provided to the group beyond what's stated on slide 6, and there's a record of it.
That's an important point. Thank you very much.
The study group identified, and we're on slide 8 at this point. The study group identified 4 key goals: ensuring that the results are clear and easy to understand, strengthening the system's growth components so that real growth is incentivized and rewarded, modifying high school accountability so it better reflects college and career readiness standards and is in alignment with 3 through 8, and then lastly, maintaining our proficiency standards. This will be organized by the different headers that we just talked through there. So ensuring results are clear and easy to understand. There was some level of consensus around this idea that a 100-point scale is more intuitive than a 150-point scale and might better reflect the state's proficiency expectations. Additionally, allowing up to 25 points for exceeding the expectation would maintain continuity with our existing system and recognize exceptional achievement. Based off of the simulations that we've run, the conversations that we've had, the recommendation would be to implement a 100-point scale where 100 is Louisiana's goal and 25 incentive points are provided for exceeding the state's goal, and then develop one or more letter grade scales based on stakeholder input for BESE's consideration.
Yes, Morris.
Is there anything within this recommendation with regard to time for implementation?
That engagement timeline is addressed in there.
Can you remind me again on the 100-point scale, what is what's considered an A?
We'll have to develop the scale score. The scales according to bullet 2, but in the simulation that we ran, an 80 was an A, as I recall.
Thank you.
But again, all of those simulations, as we go through this feedback process, various things in that proposal will change, and as a result, those scales will likely need to change as well. Those simulations were intended to be informative as we walk through the implications of different policy measures that we might take, or that the board might take.
Let's keep going.
In the world of student growth, the following points we think capture the significant areas of discussion on student growth. The first one is growth expectations vary widely depending on achievement level, particularly in that step 1 as we talked about, and conflate performance and achievement status because of the floor that students receive for mastery and 150 for advanced. Real growth should be rewarded and non-real growth should not be. Because of the weight of growth, schools can grow students at a high level and still be identified as an F due to the weight. And then we discussed how other states approach growth and the limitations of our current assessment scale. We'll go through the draft recommendation and then we'll pause for discussion on this item. So on student growth, seek expert input on the development of a simulation that seeks to minimize negative scale score change or non-real growth for students not scoring at proficient, and raise expectations to receive points in this index to be for above average growth. 2, as the rigor of our growth model is implemented, increase the weight of growth in elementary schools such that schools that grow students can reasonably be expected to improve 1 or more letter grades if they are growing students. Consider that any additional percentage in growth could be based on the improvement of the bottom 25% of student scale scores. This is aligned with conversations around the way that Florida and Mississippi double weight their lowest, the 25% of students that have the lowest scale scores in their building. And then lastly, prioritize Louisiana's ability to create a more intuitive growth measure and improve the level of information available from our assessment to improve measures of student growth in the future. We should seek expert input on the long-term strategy to improve the student growth measure, and we should include these and other findings of this study group as a consideration for future RFPs for our assessment vendors, specifically including considerations for a vertical scale.
Dr. Davis?
So on bullet point number 1, it ends with the phrase above average growth. Does that mean that we're seeking to develop a growth standard that is only going to reward students if the school or if that student is above average for the state? What does that mean?
So we would seek expert advice on the best way to implement this in the VAM. The VAM model does compare students across the state definitionally. Right now we award points by quintile going down. So the conversation that I think we've had is around strengthening this growth measure. And this is one way that we could do that. But we would also want to rely on expert advice on what it actually means on a VAM to be a rigorous amount of growth. And above average seem to be a good way of saying that and leaving the room for the chair, experts, and then to come back with a revised simulation.
So if I'm thinking about this correctly, right? So what this is doing is that it is getting rid of the problem of, under BAM, we reward a school who moves a child 2 points towards mastery because that's that child's goal, but then we don't reward a school or child that is moved 8 points by their school if their growth target was 10, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so that's the way we're doing it now, which is crazy words. And so what we're trying to do here, right, is fix that. But I am concerned that we're not doing what Mr. Morris has said all along, is that we want to recognize growth with this idea that it has to be above average growth. I mean, because our goal was we want to be rewarding schools that are moving children. And so my concern is that for the kids that are going to be the hardest to move, that have the most barriers to educational attainment, that require all of those additional resources heaped upon them, they're going to be moving, but they're going to be below whatever state average we might come up with. And so I guess I'm more committed to we recognize schools that are moving kids rather than necessarily comparing them to the average student in the state. And so I guess perhaps that's a conversation to have as we talk with these experts, but I just want to be clear when we sit down with the experts that that has been something that repeatedly on this committee we've said that we have prioritized.
Okay, so let's get even more granular. Is there a specific language you'd like to see then in the recommendation as it relates to the expert piece? And while you and Ronnie are thinking about that, I'll go to Garvey and come back.
Yeah, while we're thinking about the language, let me check to see if I understand the situation correctly. I think we might have a problem with the word growth and how we're using it. My understanding, and I'm looking at Thomas to ask him to correct me, is that under the current system, we are rewarding under the label growth schools that have children that are actually regressing, in the sense that throughout the year, the child did not learn a year's worth of information. They learned 3/4 of a year maybe, which is considered growth, but they're regressing. And that's because we have the two-part analysis on the growth. On the one part, if you don't get points that way, you go to the second part, and the second part is the one that contains this equation that I would argue is broken because it's rewarding children that are not really growing. And I think that the attempt to make a cutoff at above average growth or below average growth is an attempt to cut that out, assuming that roughly the state average is children are growing at 1 year in over 1 year. You know, they're growing by 1 year worth of learning in 1 year. And if you're below the average, you're probably regressing. If you're above the average, then you're really making real growth. You're growing more than a year in a year's worth of time. Is that roughly what this idea is?
You want to speak to it now?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things in the conversations is that we've had with the expert on our accountability system and assessment, Mr. Domaleski, is that we don't have a vertical scale. That
Well,
3rd grade and 4th grade.
That's why I was referring to this as an estimate. It's
Right.
a fuzzy thing.
Exactly. And step 2 seeks to, in some ways, put it on a similar scale to look at what we know about a student who scores a 725. What do we know is the likely next score that they're going to receive to account for any fluctuations or differences between the 2 years' tests and the differences in the scale. There are other ways to do that besides the VAM, but VAM is what Louisiana has used for a very long time. In looking at, in previous meetings, that table that has by quintile the percent of students that are receiving points and actually moving backward in terms of scale score change, you can see a clear pattern that the top 20%, 14% I think of students are seeing negative scale score change, but they are growing better than 80% of their peers. They are actually moving forward, but 14% of them, even with that being true, went backward. So by moving to above average, we can look at it and say, okay, what does it mean to be above average? We can work with an expert who understands BAM processes and tell us exactly where they would make those cut points, and come back with a recommendation that talks about how many students would be receiving points for negative scale score change, and do experts believe that that actually means that the kid did learn something, and they are being served well by their school or better by their school than if they were attending another school. Is that clear as mud?
The recommendation is that more expertise is needed, right, to even resolve the fundamental difference, I think, it's been shared today. Yeah.
So, I've been in this work group for, what is this, 7 meetings now? And I've learned a lot. But the first bullet is difficult for me to understand. So, with regard to further interpretation of that language, I was wondering if we could consider something that made it a little easier to understand for the casual reader. You know, my level of interest here is for us to consider a system going forward that better recognizes raw incremental growth. And the sensitivity is that, as I understand it, the current test that is in place assesses the student's growth at a specific grade, the grade level. And given that 2/3 of our students are less than mastery, then that would indicate there's quite a number of students that aren't at grade level. So why would you have a test to assess students when 2/3 of them aren't at grade level? When the test is focused on that grade level material, it seems to me like the expectations would be extremely low, for those test results if you're trying to measure growth. If you're trying to measure grade level assessment, then that would be the appropriate test. But if I'm trying to assess raw growth, which my understanding is what we're trying to do, then the vertical approach would seem to be a better approach to do that. I've got feedback, we've got students that are 1 year behind, 2 years behind, even more than that, right? So you want to be able to, if you're really trying to assess growth, you want to have a tool that can do that. And then you've got the EOCs that are going to give us an indication of where a student is relative to expected grade level. So that's my thoughts on the first bullet. We can talk about how to potentially work the language, but that's my thoughts on the first bullet. I'd like to see it simplified and with more focus on how to better accurately measure raw growth, given the student population that there seems to be so much focus on.
Okay. Just so is that a substantive difference, or is that a rewriting of the first bullet? I hear your point, and I think that's what we've been discussing for some time. So is this a cosmetic difference to the first bullet? I just want to get clear, because perhaps we can rewrite it together now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, just for me personally, the language is not easy to understand.
Okay, so there's a,
And I'm not sure that specifically addresses my concern.
okay.
Can you look at bullet 3 with us and see if it starts to address your concern? Or the third big bullet and then the 2 items underneath it?
More intuitive growth measure. I think that's what I heard you just say.
I don't see any reference in here to raw student growth. There's a general reference to improved measures of student growth. It's very general.
Okay.
My particular interest is in, again, a tool that's going to accurately measure raw student growth, regardless of the starting point.
Okay. I hear you.
And I don't think that you can do what he wants us to do and what I want us to do if we're only going to give students in their schools points for achieving above average growth. That's not the same thing as measuring movement by a kid.
Are we actually
averaging,
Yeah, please.
are we actually averaging the growth? And then people that are above that growth will be rewarded? Because that is how I feel that the above average growth reads. And I think it might be more appropriate to say higher than the usual level of growth for that student or for that grade level or something like that, because it almost implies that you're taking an average growth for that grade level or whatever and then rewarding for those that have achieved higher than that.
I'm going to go
I
ahead.
have two ideas. Well, I have one
Let me go to
idea.
Mr. Garvey and then give you the floor. Go.
Yeah, I don't remember the term that was used. Well, Ronnie and Linda was saying, yeah, we're looking for something that can measure raw score growth, raw point growth. What was it? Raw growth. Raw growth. I thought that going to a vertical scale, which is mentioned in number 3, is what gets you to being able to measure the raw growth. So if I'm right, then what Thomas has written here, I think is going to try to solve what you're asking for. And maybe adding a couple of languages in here after the word for a vertical scale, you might say for a vertical scale that will allow us to better measure raw growth. Might make that point clear.
Or measure scale score improvement or implement a value table approach. Value table was the example that we went through with Chris. So at the end of that, for a vertical scale, to enable better measurement of scale score improvement or implement a value table approach.
I mean, I don't even know if we need that level of specificity, but maybe others do. I think the first part of the sentence is likely sufficient, and then we need expertise to determine that last piece. That would be my perspective, but I think the first part captures the... So can we just come back then in light of that to the first bullet? Ari, and I think Mr. Morris is suggesting that gets entirely removed.
I'm not necessarily proposing be removed. I just don't think it's very easily interpreted, and therefore you open the door to misinterpretation.
Okay,
It's
so,
right, it's right.
so let's clarify the core idea, Thomas, of the first bullet is,
Build on our existing growth model and improve its rigor is the idea.
that's the idea.
This includes more specificity of how we might do it. We could leave that specificity out and leave that to expert minds, or if it's important enough to the study group, we should be specific about what boundary conditions.
Yeah,
I'd like to make a suggestion, because of, what you're saying about the vertical growth part, bullet point number 3 makes sense, but what bullet number 1 is saying is that we want to be able to change so that we can measure raw growth, but we only want to reward that raw growth if it's above average. And that's kind of right now, to me, problematic, given all along we have said we want to be rewarding schools that are moving children. All right, and so I would like to see one possible change for bullet number 1, say, seek expert input to develop a simulation that seeks to minimize negative scale score change for students not scoring at proficient and raising expectations regarding how points are received on this index. And then that way it takes out this assumption somehow that we are only going to reward schools for students that are above average, and allows us to have that expert lay out possible mechanisms for rewarding growth.
including but not limited to the possibility that an expert may suggest that as one pathway.
Yes, and then we can argue with him about that.
Okay. Mr. Garvey, are you comfortable with that change?
I'll read it
Yes.
back. Seek expert input to develop, and we're just going to skip all the way to the end, and we're going to delete receive points in this index to be above average growth and replace it with awarded.
Receive points to be awarded.
Wait,
I said
expectations to,
raising expectations regarding how points are received on this index.
Regarding how points are received on this index.
He was changing it to instead of receive, awarded, or. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Thanks, everybody. That was helpful. Let's keep going.
Summary of the high school discussion. In discussions regarding high school, several key questions emerged about why high school scores are higher than elementary scores, and whether these scores reflect an accurate picture of how well prepared Louisiana's graduates are for post-secondary success. 3 indices were identified as needing review to determine its relative rigor and alignment. The ACT index was determined to award points for non-Jumpstart graduates who take the WorkKeys assessment. The graduation rate, while higher than the other indices, is one that we have limited abilities to adjust because the ESSA requirement is that it be based off of the graduation rate. And then the Strength of Diploma Index, which can be thought of as working in tandem with the graduation rate index, is the one that we've spent a lot of time talking through and will be part of the next slide. This simulation was run and shared with the study group and resulted in general alignment between elementary school and high school scores to that goal that we talked about at the beginning about high school scores reflecting similar rigor to elementary school scores. So the draft recommendation here would be to seek stakeholder feedback on the high school simulations, including reactions to a more rigorous Strength of Diploma Index that expects the earning of credentials and experiences beyond a high school diploma, and ideas to improve the simulations design. Identify areas to improve the measure to better measure college and career readiness. Have an ACT WorkKeys index that no longer allows for the replacement of WorkKeys scoring of students on a top university pathway. In addition, identify policy considerations to ensure that there are no unintended consequences from this change. Seek stakeholder input on a banded approach to awarding ACT points. That proposal, that item reflects many of the conversations that were had in June of 2021 when this previously came before the board. The weighting should include an increased focus on our LEAP 2025 assessments as the simulations included, and we should also ask the stakeholders what resources would be needed to implement if these new expectations were ultimately adopted. So that's stakeholder input. Ensure that the high school letter grades reflect the rigor of elementary school letter grades. Where possible, match the high school growth measurement to be consistent with the way that the elementary methodology works. And then lastly, develop a process to study our credentials in partnership with the IBC Council, including creation of an intermediate credential between basic and advanced.
Thank you. Opening it up for any questions or discussion. Dr. Davis.
I have a question about the, when we discussed the banding of ACT points. As I was going back and trying to research, how we're doing this now with the ACT and WorkKeys, and in particular around this switch to where we're not going to award any points for WorkKeys for students that are on the career diploma path. Can you explain to me why WorkKeys has a silver, gold, platinum, but it also has a bronze level, and we don't award any points for bronze? And according to the ACT folks, you need at least a 3, a bronze level on each core assessment in order to receive certification from them. So why do we not award any points for students who are reaching bronze?
I would have to do more research and get back to you on that.
Okay, because if we're going to mess around, with this, and we're going to think about banding, I'd like to have the bronze level in the discussion, along with a discussion, is the TOPS Tech bill going to a 15 still alive, or has it died? Do we know? Or is it even when we need it? I mean, I think it had gotten out of committee, and so if we're going to have that discussion, in particular with stakeholders, I'd like some discussion at the very least about points for 17 because it receives top tech. And because just in general, the idea has always rubbed me the wrong way that we give no points to anything below an 18 on the ACT. And that if we're serious about valuing a career and tech diploma, as much as we value a university pathways component, diploma, that part of our accountability system is inconsistent with what we say we are valuing.
Yeah, Mr. Morrison.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the last statement that I heard, to make sure that there's some reference in here to looking at both high school pathways, Jumpstart and the TOPS pathway, to ensure that there is equal opportunity along both pathways, and that as that opportunity is captured along both pathways, that it's recognized equally, so that there's equal incentive for a student to pursue either pathway based on their interest and their passion. I'm not sure if we capture that or not, but I'd like to make sure that that's clear, that that's a priority.
I think we can be more explicit. Mr. Hardy?
Yeah, I have a question about the ACT 18 versus 17. And I'm looking for some more information, and I hope Thomas has it. Currently, you can get a TOPS Tech scholarship, you might say, if you get a 17 on the ACT, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Am I correct in saying that my understanding is that the ACT organization itself says that an 18, scoring an 18 means that it's fairly likely that you will do well in college and career tech classes. And that if you get a 17, you're less likely to do well in those classes. Is that
It
correct?
depends on the subject of the assessment,
Well,
for one.
Right,
So,
on average, I guess I'm saying, speaking of.
for example, English is an 18. That is the lowest one of all of them. I believe it's 22 for math. So 18 is I think that the report that they put out says an 18 means the student is likely in an English class to get a B or better in the course. They do the same thing for math, and I believe it's a 22. They do the same thing for reading. So 18 is actually the lowest sub-score that they say is college and career ready.
So, carrying that one step further, it would mean that getting to 17 means it's not likely. You said if you get an 18, you're likely to do well. If you earn a 17, that would mean you're not likely to do well, correct?
I would agree with that. I also would say that the way that the formula is currently set up, 100 is the expectation in all of our indices, right?
Okay.
Mastery is 100, 21 is 100 because it is essentially the college readiness standard. And then in the indices, we generally give some number of points for achievement that comes close but not completely to where we want students to be. And I think that at 18 was where that cut point was made many years ago.
And so my point is that 18 means you're at a level where you're likely to do well. 17, you're at a level where you might be able to do well, but it's less likely. It seems as if the legislature has decided, let's give a chance to these 17s because they might do well, and we don't want to cut them off. But the fact that the legislature has decided to give an opportunity to someone who is less than likely to do well doesn't mean it's a good
indicator.
a level that we want to say that's where we want to be. And I wanted to make that point. What the legislature decided to do to give people opportunities is different from what our accountability system should be, one could argue.
All right, Dr. Davis?
And so I get the point that you're making, but the important part of it is on average, right? And so we're creating this line in the sand below which students cannot receive points, when ACT, by its own admission, will tell you that a kid that scores a 17 on the ACT 30% of those kids will go on to have a B or higher at their community college, right? So it is not a perfect test. And so what we're doing is we're deciding that this is our line and that we're not recognizing the fact that there are students who have that 17 or lower that might go on to be successful because we're not giving them any points. Like, so for instance, there's a reason we have the April Dunn Act, right? She could not graduate high school because we required her to pass all of the EOCs. Yet she went on to successfully graduate from community college without scoring an 18 on the ACT, right? And so and that goes to, I think, a point that I would like to, the ACT does not give kids with IEPs accommodations. Is that correct? Like in the LEAP, when you have an IEP that allows you extended time and a host of other things, our state accountability, our LEAP test gives them those accommodations, but the ACT does not. And so I already think that we are stacking the deck against our special education students and the schools that educate them with the changes that we're making, but for sure we are doing it when it comes to the ACT.
Okay, do you want to speak to this, Thomas?
I just sent a note to a member of my team to just confirm my understanding, but Mr. Garvey, I think that's it also.
Okay, Mr. Garvey. And I also want to say, wait, one quick thing on just earlier point about the legislative item. The legislative bill around the 15 has no longer exists.
Okay, thank you.
Going back to the analogy I was making between legislation and our accountability system, I would make the point that the accountability system, as we said earlier, is one of its purposes is to incentivize good education results. And I would suggest, I don't have nothing to prove this, but I would suggest that we will end up getting more ACT scores of 18 and 17 if the minimum bar for points is an 18 rather than if we lower it to 17. So if you want more kids to get educated to the point where they can score a 17, I think you will get that if the bar is 18. If you lower the bar to 17, you're lowering the bar. And I think everybody understands that a lot of times when you lower the bar, what people shoot for and what they achieve gets lowered too. So I think having the 18 as the cutoff helps students achieve a 17, helps more students achieve a 17 and get the TOPS tech money that we're hoping to get.
So this is a topic that likely we're not going to reach result on this.
You can't win, you can't prove it.
Right, different philosophies, and it's important that I think we had that discussion. The question on the table for you is there anything that needs to be included in the recommendation for us to feel comfortable bringing this conversation to the board, where there will also be wide ranges of perspective on this particular topic too? Yes, I'll go to Dr. Davidson and back to Mr. Garvey.
So I do have some questions, and this is in part a function of watching the Superintendent's Advisory Council meeting yesterday about how this new weighting changes high school scores for kids who are categorized as special education. Because right now, in the current system, right, they would get points for those students for, the graduation twice, right? So they might, what kind of scores do you receive on the EOC index for a child who is special education and does not pass the EOCs but is still allowed to graduate? Are they given a 0 on the EOC?
Yes, they are.
So they're given a 0 on the EOC. You're going to give them points for graduating. But then now the strength of diploma, right, where high schools would have received points for those students with developmental delays and a host of other things, they are now, right, that is removed for them, and they are now dependent on strength of diploma, like an AP class or dual enrollment at the collegiate level. And so I'm worried about where we're making accommodations for those students and the high schools that serve them in these changes.
That is a good point. So can we, then what's the recommendation that would,
I think that maybe it needs to be under the when we're seeking stakeholder feedback, to specifically ask about special populations such as special education students and perhaps even our English as a second language learners as well. Because when it comes to strength of diploma, I have no idea, even on our Jump Start and career and technical pathways, like what are our obligations for Spanish speakers, for instance, when it comes to providing them access to that coursework in another language. So I would say that just there needs to be maybe, and I think the people that are most likely to know how this is how it's working out there in the field would be our superintendents and principals, who I hope we're going to be, engaging.
all right, great point, thank you. Okay, I suggest we keep going. Mr. Rodriguez?
Yeah. The very last two lines say, read, including the creation of an intermediate credential between basic and advanced. I don't remember hearing discussion on that. Can you tell me, was that early on in the meetings of this group?
It was part of the conversation around the 75 point, because there, to Mr. Morse's point earlier about making sure that there's like equal opportunity for a school regardless of the path the kid's on. We don't currently have a career credential that falls in that 75 category. So the conversation was around adding potentially, if we can create a rigorous credential between basic and advanced, so that there is not only a college-going opportunity on the 75 category, but also a strong credential to go along with it.
Have we started talking to who would be career tech college people about this?
We've begun discussions inside of the building, and we've also started engaging with folks that work in the nonprofit sector that work with credentialing, and they agree that there's an opportunity to do something, to take several high-quality basic credentials and bundle them together, and give a kid a set of experiences that individually might not be extremely valuable, but together are very valuable. There was an example that was given to me of like patient care tech, an emergency medical technician or responder, whichever one is the lower level, and individually they are not as valuable as they are together. Or if you put a phlebotomy tech into those three, you've got three basic credentials that are in the healthcare sector that currently, if you got all three of them, it actually does good things for kids, but you're getting basic level credit. And it might not quite be advanced because that's the strongest of the credentials, but it's doing a good thing for kids. So it is something that we can explore, and if we can't develop something that is rigorous, then we don't include it.
And so the initial feedback from the nonprofits is encouraging.
Yes.
I take it from what you're saying. Thank you.
Let's keep
Ms. Jones?
moving. Oh, Mr. Morris?
Yes, I had two other comments before we move on. There was some brief discussion recently about attendance and how to address attendance concerns or lack thereof. But I don't see any mention of that in here. And I think, given the conversations we've had as a full board around truancy and what those concerns are, whether we make any changes in that regard or not, I think it's worthy of a conversation. So I'd like to bring that conversation to the full board, so we can somehow include that here.
Sure. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
I would second that
Yeah.
suggestion.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that, we should do that.
The other comment I had is with regard to
Yeah, we can, because I'm not sure.
is with regard to simulation results that would give the other board members some indication of the impact or implementation of these recommendations. So what kind of shift, would we expect to see with regard to implementation of any or all of these recommendations? I think that would be appropriate.
Okay.
I would anticipate that this group would meet again during the summer once we've received feedback, come back together, have another meeting to discuss what adjustments to simulations we would like to see, and then in August, when proposals actually come before the board, there are actual simulations based off an actual proposal that the study group is comfortable with.
Mr. Morris, I want to come back to your earlier point on attendance. Are you, just to be more precise on what the recommendation is, are you suggesting that we consider attendance as part of the actual formula or something else?
I think that'd be a good conversation starter.
Okay. Understood. Go ahead. Dr.
And so this was kind of some specific language around my recommendation for change under the seek stakeholder feedback, including, and then would be to add a bullet, how these changes impact important subpopulations, including but not limited to special education students and English as a second language learners.
Are you more interested in how it would impact the student or in how it would impact the school?
I think both, right? Because if we have, and we have a significant number of English as a second language learner students that are entering at high school, and they don't speak any English, and how many years does it take for them to gain fluency?
Our policy language says 6.
6. So they don't even have the 6 years that they need in high school to gain fluency. So I think that it's important to think about whether or not our career and technical pathways are providing coursework for them in a language, right, that they can read. And I think that that's probably problematic. But then that becomes not only problematic for that student, right, that we're not allowing them access to the same classes that their English-speaking counterparts have access to, but also then we are penalizing high schools that have large numbers of English as a second language learner populations, like Jefferson, Orleans, East Baton Rouge Parish. I mean, in some cases, this is 20% of a school district student body. And so I think that those are important things for us to think about. And I apologize for not thinking about it earlier, but the superintendent's, that discussion made me start thinking, started out with just special education, but then it pushed me towards other students who might have barriers to gaining what we are now saying is really what we're calling a quality high school education for them, but then also how that is going to impact the schools that are serving them.
I'm also hopeful that in what resources would systems need to implement this, that would include what types of advocacy and expectations we would need to put on credentialing agencies, et cetera.
That's good.
The K2 accountability summary, we went through and essentially recapped where K2 accountability was in June of 2021, with the request essentially being that the board would endorse the concept of K2 accountability and studying the use of instructional quality measures alongside the literacy assessment. We know that we can't develop an accountability system until we have data in order to simulate the outcomes and until we have a complete study of how different instructional quality measures can be used together, how valid and reliable are they. So the recommendation would be that we endorse the concept, or the board endorse the concept of a K2 accountability system, continue to study instructional quality measures alongside the literacy assessment. After multiple years of reliable data are available, provide policy recommendations to BESE for consideration in the implementation of a K2 accountability system aligned with our 3 through 12 system, and maintain a study group focused on progress and development of K2 accountability systems.
Ronnie?
Yeah, a couple comments on this one. The first one, if someone could help us to recall the statute requirement for this one. I know Senator Hewitt kind of bill was passed with a specific timeline relative to literacy in this grade group. And just want to make sure that we're clear on what the legal requirements are and what that timeline is. Can someone refresh us on that?
The law does not have a specific date by which we must include it in the accountability system, but it does indicate that we will need to. There is no specific date that it has to be in the system.
So I recall there is a specific date for for some aspects within that bill. Can somebody clarify what those requirements are?
It's for sorry, I believe it's for the literacy screener and the implementation of the screener. I believe the actual accountability component doesn't have a set timeline. I believe that to be true.
Okay, and so obviously the output from the literacy screener would be input into this process. Okay, thank you for that. Next one I had was, there had been, I thought, some really good conversation on this topic previously with regard to the lack of any references to numeracy in the K-2 accountability system. I don't see any reference here to that, so I'd like to see some reference included to that.
Can we just, let's have that conversation briefly across the study group again. Can you summarize again, Ronnie, I know it came up in the last discussion, what you mean by that? Just want to see if anybody else would have any response to that.
Yeah, sure. So certainly, I know everyone appreciates the focus on literacy, and the department has set some aggressive goals to improve where we are in that area, and certainly have high expectations for those students, for that improvement. But numeracy is going to be equally important at grade 4. And I think that we need to get comfortable that our students are prepared for those expectations at grade 4 as well. So I think it's a reasonable expectation that if we're going to have some accountability for literacy, it's also reasonable that we have some accountability for numeracy for those students entering 4th grade.
So perhaps include at the end of the third bullet about maintaining a study group on this and encourage the development of a numeracy indicator.
That sounds fine. Again, it'll get the conversation started and we haven't lost track of that focus.
Draft recommendation 5, next steps in stakeholder engagement. Seek feedback from a variety of sources on simulations, barriers to implementation, problems and solutions the study group has identified in alignment with the recommendations that will hopefully be approved today. Utilizing at a minimum the following means: feedback via an email address as well as online portal. Early June, begin getting feedback at the Teacher Leader Summit from a variety of stakeholders as we've been doing over the last several months. June 15th, BESE meeting, consideration of the report and recommendations with a process update and discussion. June and July, small group engagement on the work group proposals and recommendations that are in here with organizations representing school systems, professional organizations, community members, parents, and other stakeholder groups. July, BESE councils consider and potentially endorse, including the Accountability Council and the Superintendent Advisory Council. And then in August, BESE update and considerations.
Yes.
I have some concerns about, well, the first one, I have a concern about the next to the last bullet in July, the BESE councils for consideration and endorsement, the Accountability Council and the Superintendent's Advisory Council. I know most all of us, got feedback from the Superintendent's Advisory Council earlier this week, and we recognize that input is important. I just wonder if we wait till July to get that input, that didn't sort of late in the process if we're coming to BESE with it in August. So I just want to make sure that we've given, all the stakeholders a reasonable amount of time to not only provide their input, but for all the stakeholders to feel comfortable that there's been a reasonable amount of time to process their input. So I'd like to see some consideration given to the timeline in general, and then I'd also like to get a better understanding, once all this information is gathered, how's it going to be processed? Who's going to be reviewing it? What does that process look like? I don't have a good feel for that.
So on the first point, Mr. Moore, so this is in alignment with the regularly scheduled meetings that are already on the calendar for both of those councils. So the next meetings, I believe, for the Superintendent and Advisory Council is July 18th. 28th, and the Accountability Council is, you know.
Right, so get the point.
So we need we need another way earlier. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you know, so I get your point. First of all, I appreciate how these dates came about. If that's where we land, then obviously we're able to conclude that's appropriate because some sort of special meeting or other is not necessary. And then we feel like there is appropriate time between this meeting and the August BESE meeting to process that input and include it in any recommendations that go to the full board.
Okay.
As long as we're comfortable with that, then okay, but I just want to make sure that, again, we give that consideration.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Garvey?
No, Madam Secretary.
Okay.
Do you have anything?
Second question, which is more, what are we going to do to, I think you had a question on synthesizing all of this input into some,
In the slides, we've actually started to synthesize the feedback that we've received on each of the proposals just in our conversations with folks. So I think that it would be good to just kind of walk through that feedback we've received, and we'll utilize a similar format here going forward. So this slide reflects the summary of feedback we received on the ACT work keys. I may have missed some along the way, but we're going to do a much better job of organizing this as we go. But ACT work keys feedback, college readiness has been held at our stage to a 21 composite. Why aren't we awarding points below that expectation? In tension with that, we've heard, why aren't we rewarding schools for helping students receive TOTS tech funding, to Dr. Davis's point. Previous ACT proposals included a banded approach to the ACT, which were aligned with high school recognition with the amount of funds that students receive via TOPS Opportunity TOPS Tech. Why wouldn't we explore that? In the strength of diploma, how will the revisions to the strength of diploma impact small populations, particularly with Act 833 and credentialing? How do we ensure the quality of all the enrollment coursework, since all of the other indicators have an assessment associated? Do we have the right set of credentials? Are there more credentials, experiences, and coursework that could be rigorous enough to value similarly to an old endorsement style model? Consider renaming this index College and Career Acceleration or another name, because as proposed, this index is not measuring the diploma, but instead beyond high school. This set of incentives would be extremely costly to school systems and would disproportionately negatively impact rural school systems that are not geographically located near a community college and other resources. Is this devaluing the high school diploma? Are we changing the high school experience to be beyond? And is that the right signal? This would be a significant change to how high schools are measured and significantly change high school scores almost overnight. Is there any consideration for a phase-in? Are these the right expectations? And then how do we recognize 5th and 6th year graduates in the formula? Assessment index, student growth and long-term goals. The system should remove points for students who achieve below mastery. We're currently awarding at 80, either in the short or the long term. In contrast with that, we've also heard from folks that we should provide incremental credit in terms of approaching basic, because we currently award nothing below basic. Incremental growth and progress should be rewarded. A variety of perspectives have been shared on negative scale score change, what it means, what its relationship is to the student's skill development over time. And then we've had a variety of perspectives on BAM being pro-BAM, disagreeing with BAM, et cetera. So we're capturing that feedback, Mr. Morris. We'll continue to synthesize it and try to be an honest broker of what we're hearing, regardless of our perspectives on the matter.
Yeah, that's not really my question. Let me try again. I appreciate that we're making an honest effort to get stakeholder input from all interested stakeholders. I appreciate that there's a method to gather that information. But if we're going to go to BESE, the full board in August with recommendations, I'm trying to understand how do we get from that population of input to process that input and then actually come to a recommendation.
we need another meeting, right? Like, we would need a meeting before that August meeting where, and that's why I think the example Tom's provided is useful, because the department would be responsible for sharing with us some synthesized version of feedback. We would then hear that as a study group, make a difference, you know, amend our recommendations or direct the department to go in a certain direction, and then that's what we go forward for August, right? So we would need more time with that synthesized data.
That's my whole point, right? Is if I look at the schedule and you're going to get input from these stakeholders in July, middle of July, BESE's, yeah, and in BESE, update and consideration. So I thought July was going to be the update and consideration, and then I thought August was going to be recommendations, which would be the next step.
Right.
And so I'm concerned about the language there. And then if basically following these mid-July meetings, that all this information, sometime following these mid-July meetings, all this information is going to be gathered, it's going to be synthesized. Then this group has got, what, 2-3 weeks to go through all that information, think on it, process it, and then put it in some form of recommendation. I'm just wondering, is that reasonable? And at what frequency is this group going to meet? How many times is this group going to meet to process all that? I'd like to get a better feel for that.
So, but our role is not to synthesize the input, but rather to receive a report from the department that likely has that synthesized for us. So I don't believe it requires multiple meetings, but maybe I'm misunderstanding your. Do you see our role changing?
No, I don't see the role changing. I'm just concerned that in this 2 or 3 week period of time, I'm sure most people here plan on taking a summer vacation. That's a concern. If we could get some sort of notification right now, right, what this timeline looks like, we can plan accordingly so that we're available for it, number one.
Of course.
And then number two, after it's synthesized, I don't know what that format looks like, but we all know this has been a very complex task, and synthesizing that information is going to be a complex task, I would expect. So again, I don't know what form it's going to be presented in, I don't know how many items we're looking at, but if it's really the full scope of everything in the accountability system that's been brought forward, intuitively, I would think that's a pretty time-consuming task to give appropriate consideration to the synthesized input. So I just want to make sure we discuss that as a group, that this is an appropriate timeline, or do we need more time for this group to consider what those recommendations are going to look like?
So as a reminder, the August BESE meeting is on August the 23rd. According to this timeline, our feedback cycle would be resolved by the end of July formally, right? And then we would be meeting early August to begin reviewing the synthesized feedback in that. So I think there might be multiple meetings we probably would have in succession in early August, but I don't believe it would be difficult. It probably would be difficult, but not impossible for us to, as a study group, start engaging around the feedback at the beginning of August.
So for a planning basis, I should just keep the first week or two of August open? Is that what I'm hearing?
I would offer also that in June and July, we're going to do small group engagements with groups that represent superintendents, charter schools, community organizations. We will do that beginning round of feedback in June and July and start crafting that feedback so that we can bring this group back together. We'll also work with the chair to identify some meeting dates that we could meet during June and July and August so that folks have some time held on their calendar in the event that we need it.
So on that one, my question is, who is we? Who's leading that effort? And then what's the format for these small group engagements?
The department would lead those. We would work with the organizations that represent those individuals, and we would meet with them as we have throughout this process.
Okay, and is it intended those are going to be public meetings or non-public meetings, or what's the intent there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, as we engage with various stakeholder groups, and we all know the groups, I don't think that we would have those as public meetings. If they're private meetings with, individuals who are in this or organizations represented in the audience today, I don't think that they would expect a public meeting, but
as we always do when we seek feedback, we would have a private meeting.
Okay, I'm just looking for clarity, that's all, just so expectations are clear.
One more small thing I forgot as a note, Thomas, if we could include explicitly, you just named it, which reminded me, if we could name the Charter School Association explicitly alongside the Accountability Council and the Superintendent's Advisory Council. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Davis.
So I have two things. So the bullet by July says BESE councils for consideration and endorsement, the Accountability Council and the Superintendent's Advisory Council. The idea that we're asking them to endorse something that we haven't completely finished revising, right, I think is probably problematic, right? Because we just talked about how in early August we're going to be making the changes based on the feedback. So do those meetings need to be pushed back into August? Because we can't really ask them to endorse something that we haven't fully incorporated the changes.
Through engagement with various organizations, we're hopeful that we'll arrive at a place where we can bring revisions that they could review and endorse at their meeting in July potentially. And if there is additional feedback that needs to be taken into account, Shane can talk more through the process for endorsement with recommendations, et cetera.
So typically when we do bring something to the council, we're seeking endorsement, but we don't often get it. So that's just language, words to say that we're bringing it to them to show them what the recommendations are and to possibly seek their endorsement, but they may or may not give it.
Right. But I guess my point is, like, they don't know, even if they endorse it, if we're going to sit down and have 3 weeks of back-to-back meetings where we're incorporating feedback from all of these groups into changes, that we're asking them to endorse something that we already know could be very difficult if we're serious about taking into account, stakeholders' input.
That's why I said I would work with the chair to schedule some time during June and July so that this group could get back together.
Meet ahead.
Okay. We would endorse the concepts basically too as well. It wouldn't necessarily be that.
Mr. Garvey? Mr. Garvey?
About the Accountability Commission, I guess one question I have is the purpose of having that commission to get that group to endorse things, or is it the purpose of it to get feedback from the members about ideas that we're thinking about implementing? And I think you might could say it's a little bit of both. My point being that I think that we are probably going to bring to them, let's say, 30 ideas, whereas in the final form, only 20 of those ideas will go forward, depending on, which of the 30 makes the 20 will probably depend on the feedback we get from the Accountability Commission. But 99% of what's going to be in the final version will have been brought in concept to the Accountability Commission to get their feedback. And maybe they endorse 20 and BESE ends up picking 19 of those 20, but one of the other, from the other 10 that didn't get endorsed, but all of them will have been on the table, is the point I wanted to make. Or 99% of it.
I see it the same way.
So should we say for discussion and feedback?
Yes, and language revision. I think the point made before about our engagement in June is also an important point, and I agree with that. Yes, Mr.
Yeah,
Morris.
a couple other thoughts with regard to processing the information. I know Mr. Lambert's done an outstanding job through this whole thing, right? I think we all appreciate that, but I'm just wondering, does the department have enough resources to do this? Do we need to look for some outside help, or what are your thoughts there?
When we began this process, if the group recalls, we had a facilitator built into the process, but because of other events, that was canceled, and so at that point, the department had to take over this part of the process. I do think it would be helpful just maybe to get a nod from this group that should we need additional support to engage stakeholders for feedback in a formal way, that we would have the ability and I guess blessing of this group to do that. I don't know that we would need it, but I know Thomas's team also this summer will be doing a lot of work on processing of spring exams, trying to turn that information around, plus the actual formula that is being developed. So, I mean, I do think that, first, I appreciate that. I do think that should we need it, a nod from this group that seems appropriate for us to do might be helpful. So we haven't really discussed that in any level of detail.
How would that even work, Shan, given that if the contract is above 50,000, it would actually have to come before the full BESE board in our next meeting? Would it have to be an item on the June agenda if that was something that the department
If
wanted
it's-
to recommend?
Yeah, if it's above the 50, but if it's not, they can process it and bring it to us at the, after it's processed.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Dale.
Do I need to ask that the discussion of a contract for processing stakeholder input for the accountability work group be added to the agenda?
I think that we can, if we need to do it, and I mean, there are groups that can do it even at no cost, potentially, but in the event that we need that support, just know that we might enter into some form of contract that would be below 50. But just want to make sure this is a BESE study group, and we are facilitating for you all, that should we need that level of support, that you all felt that it would be appropriate for us to reach out and get that.
I mean, I personally, as chair, would like our full board to have the transparency and the opportunity to understand who potentially that is, et cetera. So if in fact that's something that is a need, I'd like to see it added to the June meeting.
Yeah, I did just recall that was part of their original work scope. Before we canceled that contract, one of the two things that group owned was to handle stakeholder engagement. So let's keep that in mind.
Exactly. Even more of a reason why I think the full board would have an interest in.
Just one other thing before we move on. Just like a little bit more better understanding with regard to expectations for members of this work group with regard to these small group engagements and in meetings with interested parties going forward. Is there an expectation that this work members from this work group will be engaged in any of those meetings, or will we get updates from any of those meetings, or what's the expectation for members of this work group while that work is going on?
I think that in the interest of individuals providing feedback and some level of confidentiality as folks share their thoughts, we probably won't say who we receive different feedback from, but we're happy to provide summaries of that feedback that we're receiving through some ongoing means. I'll work with you, Kira, on how we should do that.
Yeah.
And I think that depending on the group, they may be interested in having one member or more at it, but I would be concerned about having the whole group. Well, we couldn't have the whole group at
That's
it.
it. Okay, great. Dr. Davis.
Yeah, so I have like some real concerns about the idea that people are, number one, that these meetings are not going to be public, because as I look at this, I see like if you're meeting with parents or superintendents, right, we've already had the superintendents, their council weigh in on issues, and I see that a lot of these groups are just by necessity of what these groups look like going to be public, and people are going to have the opportunity to participate. But I personally don't like the fact that groups are unwilling to sign off on the changes that they want to see made to the accountability system. Because this is how we got to this situation that we're in today. We had an accountability work group that debated and studied our accountability system for months and months on end. And then at the end of the day, when it came to BESE, there were certain members of those groups that opposed things, and when they did not get their way in the vote, this is how we ended up with BESE rejecting all of that group's work, and why we're here today. And so personally, I would like to see if groups of stakeholders have suggestions about what needs to be done to this accountability system, their name, those groups' names need to be associated with it. I don't care if it's the PTA group at whatever school district, or whether or not it's, I know Mrs. Romer is all about transparency, so I know she's going to tell us, and Ryan will not be afraid to say what she thinks needs to be tweaked, and I know those guys are not going to be. And so I'm really opposed to people being unwilling to put their name with recommendations. I feel really strongly about that.
I mean, Belinda, I don't want to belabor the point, but there are likely multiple perspectives as to why we're here. I would certainly say we're here mostly because the majority of the board did not approve or agree with the recommendation. So I just want to say for the record, since you sort of framed up one way of looking at it, I think there might be multiple reasons why the majority of the board did not approve those, and our job is to put forward a set of recommendations that hopefully the majority of the board would feel good about it, and yet I hear your point about the importance of having comments public and on the record. How would we want to resolve? How might we address Dr. Davis's concerns? Mr. Garvey?
I have a thought to throw out there. I, in a general sense, agree with what Ms. Davis is saying, and I think it might be well to point out to people who are giving us feedback that human nature, BESE's being human, BESE members being human, is to rely more on information when you know where it's coming from. And if someone wants to be anonymous and take the risk that people are not going to give much weight to their suggestion, maybe you can allow them to be anonymous. But if they wanted to carry weight, then they should be willing to say who they are and who they represent when they make the suggestion. So maybe you could have a hybrid system and let them say who they are if they want, and let them not say who they are if they want. And I think it would accomplish most of what Ms. Davis is trying to do. I think most people would put their name on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, Superintendent.
I want to clarify, whenever I referenced or responded to Dr. Davis earlier about it not being public, my belief around that is if the department is going to engage with every stakeholder group that we all can think of. I was speaking about in terms of, do we put out a public agenda? Do we live stream a meeting between two people? I mean, I don't think that's something we would do. That's a different level of transparency versus, what groups did you speak with, generally what did they say. So I just want to clarify my point there.
That's a good point, but Mr. Garvey's point to build on Dr. Davis's is that in the synthesis that is shared with this group and ultimately serves as backup to the full board, we can distinguish ideas and feedback that have people's name on it from anonymous ideas, right? And I think that's a really thoughtful idea, because you're saying, naturally speaking, those who are willing to put their name on it, we might be more inclined to follow up, understand where the idea is originating from, et cetera. Am I getting that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I like that idea. What do you think about that? Great.
When it's a public meeting, you have specific written feedback that the board can read. Like with SAC and accountability, you receive the minutes and you see the feedback. Otherwise, some things could be left to chance as to whether they were taken into consideration.
Okay. All right. Mr. Morris.
Yeah, just one more that I don't think we've covered, but I think it's interesting and we should at least chat about it, is I understand the hesitation to make any specific recommendations right now with regard to the timeline of implementation. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that some of these initiatives have already taken off, right? Fast Forward has already taken off, dual enrollment, been a lot of work with Board of Regents, on that work. So I think there's a certain sensitivity that needs to be addressed, that some of these initiatives have already taken off, but the accountability system hasn't recognized any specific accomplishments in those initiatives. So there's a gap there, and consideration for regard for time of implementation is going to be important. We're asking school leaders to obviously make decisions that are in the best interest of students, but they're also, their SPS is going to be a topic of conversation at their meetings, right? So I think it's fair that we give that some consideration and that be something that's brought to BESE to at least begin those conversations so that gap is identified and it's considered when we talk about timing of implementation.
We might include that on draft recommendation 3 under seek stakeholder feedback on, and just include a bullet on timeline for implementation.
Good. Yeah. Okay, so, Mr. Gargan?
We were handed out this version right before the meeting started, and it looks to be pretty darn close to this version.
It
Is there a difference?
No,
Just notes.
I just wanted you to have the hard copy. Okay, so there's a motion and a second on the floor, and we've had rich board discussion. I'd love to hear from public, move to public comment. Okay. All right, Dr. Wendy Boudouin, Louisiana School Board Association.
No.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Wendy Boudouin, Louisiana School Boards Association. I want to start out by thanking the board for having an opportunity to give public comment on the different recommendations and proposals that have come through in the 7 previous work group meetings. I want to start off by saying and acknowledging BESE member Moore's comment about motivating adults in the room. It was a comment that a lot of our members did not like. There was a lot of conversation around SAC about words mattering and what that statement meant as an accountability system to our membership and what it said about the role that they have. So I appreciate those comments. Also, and that Dr. Davis has similarly made comments about that before. So I want to thank you for listening and reflecting that feedback, that words matter, and understanding the position of our membership. I do want to just make a few points about the proposals or the recommendations that are happening, and then just give some general information about things we haven't heard discussed yet, and why our association thinks that the timeline of 2 months of feedback is not sufficient. With regard to student growth, we have heard a lot of conversation about different growth models and the way that you measure growth and non-vertically aligned assessments and whether or not our assessments truly capture students at a lower performance level. And those conversations are integral to the work of creating growth and establishing growth models. And so having those conversations separately seems to be a little bit out of order to our membership. And so anytime you're having a conversation about growth, you should simultaneously be having a conversation about the assessment that's impacted by growth. 2 points that I haven't heard brought up at the work group meeting, and perhaps they were mentioned, but I haven't seen them yet. The focus on Mississippi and Florida. For both of those growth models, they do have some information that I'm not sure has been shared yet. In Mississippi in particular, they don't actually have the same point scale for elementary and middle schools as they do for high schools. They actually can earn a different number of points in either of those systems, which I think affects the conversation when you're thinking about aligning high school to elementary school scores. The second piece is Florida. The Florida growth model that's been talked about significantly in this work group has been retired by Florida. Florida has actually decided to change their assessment and move to a pre-interim and post-assessment within the same year and measure progress as opposed to growth from end of year to end of year. That's a new position that Florida has taken and is moving towards. In terms of the high school experience, we have a number of concerns with the slide that shows the table of strength of diploma index. One of those primary concerns is the imbalance in that slide between college and career readiness indicators, as well as the lack of reflection of positive outcomes for students with disabilities and other students with extra needs. Just as an example, in the category in which you can earn 100 points, there are 4 pathways to earn college credentials and only 1 pathway to earn a career credential. So we'd like to see balance in proposals for accountability where all students have equal opportunities to earn equal number of points. Additionally, there was conversation about alignment and talking about alignment. And something that we haven't really heard, particularly in the conversation about alignment, is whether or not 3 through 8 is currently measuring the right indicators. We know that there's a significant priority focus on college and career readiness at the high school level, but those skills start to be built fairly early in the educational experience, and we haven't yet heard discussion about what those indicators could look like in a 3 through 8 or K through 8 environment to create true alignment of college and career readiness. We also haven't heard conversations that center around whether or not the alignment and elementary and middle school is establishing the same goals. I don't even think that's a grammatically correct sentence, my apologies. Whether what we're measuring in elementary and middle is properly aligned. Most of the focus has been particularly on whether high school is measuring the proper thing, and we, as an association, believe if we're having this conversation, it should be a conversation about the entirety of the system to ensure continuity and alignment. And then finally, there's been a lot of conversation about the inflation of scores, the inflation of high schools, and whether there are too many A's and too many B's. And one of the points that we'd like to make is that we haven't heard the conversation about the ways the current accountability system deflates scores for schools. As an example, any student who simply is a non-participant in the test is assigned a 0 achievement level. That's not a score that the student earned, but it is a score that the school receives nonetheless, thereby deflating their assessment index. And so there are balance issues that haven't been discussed that we'd love to have conversations about, because some of the inflation of scores might be a result of the deflation of scores, and so we'd like to have those conversations. And I'll summarize, or I guess I'll end with this. As an association, I will say publicly that we are interested in public discourse. We find that the conversations are more robust and in-depth when you have those conversations in the public. Our association is open to having those conversations in the public. I will say, as I stated at SAC this week, that a 2-month time period to consider the information that has been presented is not going to be a sufficient manner of time in order for those stakeholders' input and feedback to be incorporated into the proposal. This board has, or this work group has been meeting for approximately 6 months and has had 8 meetings and has come up now with a set of recommendations and proposals that can go to the public to limit the public to a 2-month time period and have us think that our input is going to end up reflected in these proposals that ultimately go to BESE in August is a little bit difficult for us as stakeholders to grasp. So we would ask that the timeline be extended and additional public comments opportunities be given. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Dr. Ken Orbeling, speech authorization.
Good afternoon. Ken Orbeling, Superintendent of St. Charles Parish Public Schools. First and foremost, thank you so much for providing an opportunity for public comment and providing an opportunity for us to voice our thanks for operating this committee under an open and transparent way and providing us an opportunity to provide feedback. And thank you for the work that you've done up to this point. I've been able to participate or not participate, but review all the work group sessions thus far and attend those that I am available to attend, as well as a member of Dr. Bromley's Superintendent's Advisory Council. You, like myself and all educators in our great state, value accountability. We know systems are measured and held accountable, that it should result in more desired results. There's no question that as superintendents in this state, that we value accountability of our systems to make sure that we're producing students that can attain achievement at the next level, with their future determined to be. Not one superintendent or educator that I've spoken to is not in favor of a fair and equitable accountability system that values each child and considers the complexity of each system's challenges in producing achievable outcomes for its students from school to school or system to system. And finally, a system that values and not devalue or indiscriminately discriminates certain populations of students based on the structure. I will not speak on all points. I would like to speak on just a few of the high school accountability recommendations of this current proposal, the way it's, I'm not necessarily if I want to call it a proposal or report, but as reported. Just the term strength of diploma? Strength of diploma means a diploma holds value. There are plenty of opportunities that are provided to students just because they earned a diploma. A diploma that for some students means going from a 3rd grade reading level at the start of their 9th grade year to perhaps a 6th or 7th grade reading level by the time they graduate. Not ever earning a 15, a 16, or a 17 on the ACT. Yet their success isn't measured in the college diploma they will earn. For example, just this week, I surveyed my 2 principals at Hongo High School and Deseret High School and asked them to provide me a list of student names that only earned a high school diploma. And I'll reference them just as student numbers. But behind each student number is a name, a story, and a level of opportunities that were provided just because they earned a high school diploma. Student number 1 was able to purchase his dream vehicle and owns his own home in less than 4 years after graduating, then earning a welding certificate. He feels very successful.
Yeah, it's time to wrap up.
I will wrap up. Anyway, I have a list of 24 student names, none of which earned a high school diploma. None of which feel that their success is not valued by the diploma that they received and opportunity that they were provided. In closing, as many of you have stated, the speed at which this is being recommended is disconcerting. As a state, we all want our students to succeed and become successful. As proposed, many aspects of these recommendations do not embrace diversity, upholds principles of fairness for every student. Instead, if promoted as is, without true collaboration with stakeholders, closest to the work and educated to do so, will intentionally or unintentionally promote structural inequities and discriminatory practices that do not promote a culture of acceptance and dignity for every student. And to be honest, based inequities on school to school and system to systems based on the challenges that they have to overcome in their situation. Our accountability system should support and reflect access of equitable opportunities for all students to be successful. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Alan Blanchard Jr., please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the ability to attend the meeting and to speak. I'm going to be nowhere as eloquent as the last 2 people. But just wanted to go over a few things. I've been an administrator since 2000, so 22 years, at some level of administrative dealing with testing directly in schools. And pretty much every day that I go to work, or I've gone to work since that time, raising test scores has been the most important thing that we try to do. It drives every decision in the school. All our observations, who we hire, who we decide not to rehire at the end of the year. So that opening comment, I agree with Dr. Baudouin, that I take some offense to it, that teachers and educators aren't motivated or aren't doing things to try to raise the performance of our students. Because that's pretty much, I tell my faculty, my staff at my district, that we live and die by test scores. So for 22 years, most of the decisions that I make are driven by trying to raise the scores in my parish, and I haven't been that successful in the last few years. I was appointed on September 5th, 2019, or 2018, sorry, by surprise as superintendent. So I took over that first year kind of a whirlwind. But anyway, okay, a couple of other quick things. With ACT, over the years that I've been an administrator, I've had kids that have gone and taken the ACT and come back and taken it a second time. And it's rare that a kid raises their ACT score by more than a point or 2. In fact, I've had some of them raise it 5, 6 points and got investigated by ACT to see if they were cheating. So if the kid starts out with a 16, the probability, even with tutoring, that they're going to raise it to a 21 or a 22 is probably very low. I'm no expert on it, but that has been my experience. So if a kid makes a 17, I think that should count. That might be the best the kid can do. And I mean, my own personal experience, I graduated from college, worked 40 hours a week to put myself through school, graduated with a 3.0. minor in math, minor in political science, major in history, which required a lot of writing. Never made less than a B in an English class or a history class or a poli-sci class. And the highest I could ever achieve on the ACT was a 14 in English. So I don't think that a 17 by itself means that a kid is not going to make it. I'm an example of someone who did. And I know other people like me who did that. So the last point I'm going to make is we talk about average growth. I think if you put a number on what a school or a teacher can achieve, with points that school can achieve on growth, I think you remove the incentive for them to push kids. Because some kids are just not going to grow that much. I think trying to set an average of what a kid should be by a certain age on their test score, you have to look at where they start and how far you can move them and how quickly you can move them. I'll wrap it up. I think if you're going to set that kind of an average for every kid, just a blanket average, it's about the same as saying that every kid's going to be 6 feet by the time they're in 8th grade. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Mr. William Kennedy.
Good afternoon, William Kennedy, Superintendent of Clayton Parish Schools. I'm going to request to be first next time to speak, because again, I'm not going to speak as eloquently, but I will try to be real, okay? One thing that I think we need to be very careful with is defining success. Everybody in this room, I think, is successful. I'm a lowly superintendent from a rural North Louisiana school district. I'm not an attorney, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an engineer, but we're successful. Where everybody in this room is successful. So when you start looking at how you're going to judge the success of a graduate, there's a whole lot of different definitions of successful. And to be honest, and most of you know this, there's a lot of difference between North Louisiana and South Louisiana. We're all Louisianians. There's two different worlds there. What jobs are available in Calcasieu Parish and what jobs are available in Clayton Parish for a graduate are different. Okay, as the oil and gas prices go, so do the jobs. So there's a lot of things there that you can be successful in. I attended Louisiana Tech graduation this past weekend, and the speaker, he shared with the graduating class that morning what he had made on the ACT. He had also shared his success as a businessman over the last 40 plus years. It was not a sudden intended. Okay, so I think when you look at that, you've got to be very careful in how you define that success. I do believe that every child should have value in your school performance score. And everybody knows there's a whole lot more that goes into being a good school, a good teacher, than what we see in SPS. It's about caring, it's about loving, it's about showing. No kid cares what you have to say until they know you care. Now, none of that's valued. But in today's world, that SPS that comes out in the paper is huge. Kids want to be from a high-performing school. So trying to put a letter or a label on them to how they can move their school up, that's value to them. In some of this proposal, it's impossible. Every high school kid don't qualify for dual enrollment. Okay, and I venture to say, in this room are very successful people, probably all who are smarter than me. Let's all go take the ACT. We'll all get a Chromebook and we'll sit down and we'll take the ACT, a practice ACT that you don't have to pay for. 60 math problems in 60 minutes, and I was a math teacher for 14 years. That is a challenge. And I'm going to venture to say that in this room, of very successful, very intelligent individuals will be humbled by some of those test items. Okay? In the current, what we're looking at in the high school growth, all of my children are not going to qualify for dual enrollment classes. To get those extra points, they have to get dual enrollment classes. They're not going to qualify. My district is 85% economically disadvantaged. Having the ability to pay for them is because the district pays for them. Me having the money to pay for all of those that we could hopefully supply would be impossible. More affluent districts where parents could possibly pay for these, I think is an inequity between kids. Number two, I don't have a college or university or technical school within the parish. So the access to get kids to those things is a challenge there. I'm very thankful that you all are wanting to include growth. That's what a teacher's job is, to grow kids every day. That's what it should be. At that elementary level, the opportunity for growth to represent more points in middle school level, I think that's wonderful. I also agree with Dr. Davis that in the current status, when this first came out and to the growth to mastery, those that were 8th grade teachers, they said, okay, these kids have 1 year to go from 7th to 8th grade to earn 25 points. But 3rd to 4th grade, got 5 years. So the number of points they have to grow is 5 or 6. So the inequity in that, I think, is a challenge. One of the biggest challenges I see is this. I would love for the public input to be able to amen when certain things are said and raise my hand and question things that are said when they're done. And I know it's not possible. But you have a huge task before you. And if you all are going to come with a proposal for an entire BESE to adopt and accept to make these changes in August, I ask you to step back and look at the big picture. Change is not easy. Constant change is impossible. So if we don't get it right, and then we're constantly tweaking and changing, well, that is impossible.
Thank you.
So I ask that you just step back and take the time and do get it right. It takes more time than August. Sorry for extending the time.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Sheldon Jones, please.
Good afternoon, Sheldon Jones, Superintendent of Richland Parish. Eloquence seems to diminish from one speaker to the next. And I assure you I won't disappoint you with what I'll share. I did jot down some thoughts. Thank you so much for all of your time. I've been fortunate enough to attend all 5 public meetings, so you don't have to tell me about the amount of work, the amount of time that this has taken up. Thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done throughout this process. Just like to kind of share some thoughts with you in reference to the Superintendent's Advisory Council meeting that happened on Monday. I served as chairman of the council, so I just speak very candidly. As I was reviewing and preparing myself for the meeting, I looked at the agenda, and under new business there were 4 items. The meeting took 3 hours. Surely I didn't anticipate that it would take that much time. I knew item 3.4 would take quite a bit of time. So as I was engaging the council, and there are actually 22 of 69 superintendents who serve on the council, Ms. Davis, if I'm not mistaken, 17 were present, 2 proxies, 15 superintendents, and Mr. Morris was there. Mr. Goshe was there as well. And as I was thinking about the conversation, I was intentional about wanting Mr. Morris and Mr. Doris to feel as if they were part of the council. And Mr. Morris and I did have an opportunity to talk afterwards. And my thoughts reflect this idea of feedback versus input. Whether it's real or whether it's perceived, for superintendents, feedback is associated with the decision already being made. Input is associated with having the opportunity to say something that may or may not impact the decision. Superintendents are willing to sit down even if input doesn't impact change, as long as the possibility exists. Mr. Morris, I hope that you felt on Monday like you were able to give input, not to give feedback. I was intentional. I wanted you to feel like you were part of the conversation. I asked that the study group consider that same thought in engaging superintendents in dialogue, so that there could be true feedback, so that superintendents can share with you thoughts and concerns that they have. Public comment today is great. I do think we probably would have had more superintendents here today if they would have known that that would have been a part of today's meeting. But I ask that you think about that for the future, that conversations happen sooner rather than later. I offer myself and ask leadership as a resource to help facilitate those conversations in any way possible. Again, thank you for all you're doing as a stakeholder.
Thank you. Board members, committee members today, board members in general, this does conclude our public comment. Is there any other discussion before we vote on this item? Yes, Mr. Morris.
Yeah, I had one other comment to make, and I've made this before. I think it's relevant, it's pertinent here, and I think it's also relevant when we make a presentation to the full board. If I go to bese.louisiana.com, bese.louisiana.gov, then the heading here is BESE's responsibility. And if I read from that, it says, Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education provides leadership and creates policies for education that expand opportunities for children, empower families and communities, and advance Louisiana in an increasingly competitive global market. I just wanted to keep that thought ahead of everybody with regard to BESE's responsibility. I think it's applicable here. Thank you.
Dr. Davis.
So what is this work group's obligation regarding the August meeting? What exactly in the BESE meeting did we promise to present by August?
To clarify, and then Thomas, you can actually probably refer us back to the slide that lays this out. Our role is to put forward a report that captures the set of discussions and recommendations that we have been discussing publicly for the past 6 months. And likely the next month or two as we get into engagement. The department's role is to put forward a set of recommendations to the full board related to those to the reported items that we discussed, et cetera, that will be for consideration in August. Does that clarify our role versus the department's?
Well, I'm just wondering if we get to August and we realize that the task is too great to have a full set of recommendations, or I guess we have our report, but the department does not have a list of recommendations to be made because we have not been able to completely digest the feedback. Is there room to maneuver? Or are
Beyond August, you mean?
Yes.
I think anything is up for consideration in terms of timing. This is the timing we've been backwards planning from the beginning in terms of our task. The department as always has the capability to put forward recommendations at any point. I'd like those recommendations to be informed by this work group's recommendations, but I don't believe there's anything that would keep the department from reassessing a timeline should that be necessary. And I would defer to the superintendent on that, on the department's role. Do you see that similarly or not? That's what I see. Okay. If there are no other items for discussion, if there are no other points of discussion, then we have a motion and a second. Are there any objections to the motion?
The motion is to receive, so if y'all would like to make a substitute motion to approve the recommendations, that would be welcome.
Yes, I'd make a motion that we approve this report and forward it on to BESE for discussion at the June meeting.
With the revisions discussed.
Yeah, as amended, as presented or amended.
Second.
Is there a second? Great. Any objections to that? Okay. Thank you very much. And as you all know, this will be accompanied by an actual formal report that will be reflective of our changes today as well to accompany that. Thank you all. Thank you.